The young people of today are the inheritors of a world in transition. Are they being prepared? And of course they're being prepared by the educational system. But education, as we know, is easy to criticize. Student mental health challenges are on the rise, and research is coming out showing that the way we do schooling is misaligned with how young people learn best. In essence, this institution changes slowly, while the world is changing ever more quickly. As the Prime Minister noted in his opening address, humanity is facing existential risks, from geopolitical instability, nuclear and biowarfare, to unaligned algorithms. Biologist E.O. Wilson puts it best. The real problem of humanity is the following. We have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. And so there is a wisdom gap we need to fill. For a long time, researchers have known that literacy and math gaps, if they're not caught at an early age, compound over a lifetime. But to flourish in this new world, young people need tools of inner transformation. And to do this at scale, we need to create and operationalize contemplative education for adolescent learners. I think we need to create standards in the classical educational sense. We've already seen a shift in education, moving from what is worth learning about to what is worth becoming. Here we have two models on screen, the International Baccalaureate and the Common Ground Collaborative, and at their center, the middle of the framework, is who the student becomes upon graduating. In the middle we have the IB learner profile, and then on the right we have the portrait of a learner. And these list capacities that we want the student to develop across their education, not just subject matter. And so this talk will have three main takeaways. The first is the 3 lines of inquiry that led to the realization that we need to create standards. The second is the framework from which 18 standards were created. So the rationale. Standards as coherence. I'm front-loading the so what for all of these sections. And the so what here is that when topics are deemed serious, standards are created. The National Governors Association, when they were trying to figure out how to ensure that the US stayed on top of math, science, and literacy education, figured out that, hey, we need to create internationally benchmarked standards. In response to this, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine created a framework for science education that led to the next generation science standards. Standards that I've taught when I was in Hong Kong, and now I'm in New York City. So these are global standards. We also see that this occurred in mathematics education. Every state in the US had its own definition of mathematical proficiency. But that's not very helpful, so they all came together and eventually discovered that, hey, we need to create a standard definition, and so the Common Core State Standards were created. And we also see this with social and emotional learning. From the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, they also operationalized this type of education and created a rigorous set of standards. When topics are deemed serious, we make standards. Of course, when we care about something, we want to aim at the outcome. And that's what a standard is, so we're clear. A standard is not the learning experience, how something is taught. A standard is a target for instruction. So it's not saying this is the methodology that needs to occur. It's saying where are we aiming towards? And the framework here is just a conceptual basis from which standards are created. And so we're going to look at the next generation science standards and their frameworks. So when they got together, a grand committee of scientists, engineers, doctors, they discovered that, hey, every standard we create needs to contain 3 things: a scientific and engineering practice, a cross-cutting concept, and a core disciplinary idea. And so how does this look? Well, here's a standard that I've taught before, and it reads kind of academically, but develop and use a model to describe the function of a cell as a whole and ways the parts of cells contribute to the function. And so how does this contain the dimensions? Well, it contains a scientific and engineering practice using models. It contains one of these cross-cutting concepts, cause and effect, structure and function. And it contains a disciplinary core idea, life science, and the idea that organisms exist in ecosystems. And so all of their standards contain all of these 3 dimensions. And I thought this was an excellent way to create a rigorous foundation for standards. So we need standards, but why teach to adolescents? We heard many reasons from the previous speaker, which were wonderfully laid out. Adolescence is a time of dissolution. And it offers a uniquely aligned opportunity to alleviate the unique suffering of adolescence, and there's a lot of suffering, unfortunately, and establish positive behaviors that can flourish over a lifetime. Adolescence, as we know, is a biologically grounded period, and it's marked by the disintegration of many features of childhood stability. And 3 areas of lack were identified. They lack, as an adolescent, control, they lack connection, and they lack contentment. They lack control, well, internally, puberty is happening, and externally, well, their day-to-day schedule is mandated by the state. They have to go to school, they don't have much independence due to their families because they dictate their lives, and biologically, well, there's delayed maturation in the prefrontal cortex, makes them risk takers, more impulsive, and all of the skills that help in self-regulation, those are being delayed, and those are underdeveloped in their brains, so they can't control themselves. It's very unfortunate. However, there is already some research showing that mindfulness-based trainings directly improve executive functioning behavior. Connection. This is the curse of adolescents. They are hyper-aware of social dynamics, but uniquely unsuited to navigate them. It's quite unfortunate. And the research shows that there's increased activation in regions involving face processing, so they can understand the micro-expressions of your face, but have no idea how to deal with that. They're so aware of peer rejection, and they have enhanced areas of social cognition. And all of the elements that lead to long-lasting relationships, trust and reciprocity, take a long time to develop. But there are studies that show that loving-kindness meditation can increase feelings of social connection and positivity. And finally, contentment. Adolescents are hyper-focused on the self and constructing the self, right? Researchers say that it's like they've constructed an imaginary audience in front of them, and they're always performing. And what ossifies the self more than ossifying the other? But exciting new research has shown that transcendent thinking exercises, so abstract musing about topics, can help adolescents situate their understanding and their experiences within the broader trajectory of their lives. Because it's hard for them to conceptualize that they're going to live a very long time when all that they've known in that moment is rapid change. And finally, why are Buddhist practices uniquely suited to this endeavor? Since the beginning, Buddhism has had well-defined goals and concrete markers of progress, right? It began with a path in the Buddha's first discourse, where he said, hey, the Noble Eightfold Path is how to realize Nibbana. In other suttas, the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, it's referred to as the direct path. Paths have a beginning and an end, and you know when you're walking along it. In early Buddhist texts, we see the gradual path where we train in the 3 trainings, sila, samadhi, and panya. This gives rise to the supramundane path, with the 4 attainments, stream entry, once returner, non-returner, and arhat. And what's interesting, just like in the educational literature, these are directly mapped to markers of progress. And in this case, it's the progressive abandonment of the 10 fetters as you move through the 4 stages. We also see other framings of the meditative path, the 5-path model, accumulation, preparation, and so on. And again, moving between these levels is well defined. There's clear signs of success, much like in education, where when you're moving between grade levels, it's quite clear when you become competent at, let's say, a skill in mathematics. And again, we can see that these paths can be also mapped to another framework, the Bodhisattva Bhumi. And finally, we have more and more hierarchies of learning. Yesterday, we had a wonderful talk on the Vipassana jnanas. Here we have them listed again, but this time in support of the claim that there's hierarchies of progression. There's ways of moving through the path in the same way you can move through a K-12 math curriculum. So there is precedent to turn Buddhist contemplative practices into this kind of standardized model. And so what is the framework that was created? So the framework, as we know, will inform these standards. It looks like this. We're going to dive into each of the 4 dimensions this time. So there's contemplative capacities, path practices, core concepts, and enumerated elements. And for those of you who've made diagrams on PowerPoint before, you know that this took hours. So at the center, we have the contemplative capacities: virtue, stability, and discernment. And these, of course, mirror the 3 trainings that we find throughout the Buddhist canon, sila, samadhi, and panya. They were selected because they're preparatory and accessible, and they so happen to counteract those areas of adolescent lack. They counteract control. When we learn stability practices, we can discern some amount of control in our bodies. When we practice virtue, we become connected to others. And when we practice discernment, we can become content in the present moment. So these are the capacities within adolescence that this framework hopes to develop. Then we have the path practices, the ways in which we practice. So I noticed that within the Buddhist tradition, there's different ways we practice. Of course, there's attentional practices, right? Anapanasati, where we bring the awareness to the breath. But there's also reflective practices, where we inquire about a topic, deconstruct ideas. We contemplate death, for instance, deconstruct the body, contemplate the elements. And then there's affective practices, like the four abodes, where we generate target emotions and then spread those out. So there's these three types of path practices that were identified, and then the core concepts. I humbly tried to look at concepts that cut across the Buddhist canon. Much like in those science frameworks, they determined that here are the cross-cutting concepts across all science disciplines, and these concepts were chosen for their clarity, accessibility, and transferability. So we can see on the right, I've made a table in Pali and Sanskrit of some core ideas, and then on the left, they were consolidated into four main terms: dissatisfaction, causation, interbeing, and presence. And so these are the four concepts that imbue this framework. And finally, the enumerated elements are ways that we concretize these concepts. And so these were sets of practices that were chosen, again, for accessibility. And we can see here practices relating to the 5 hindrances, the 4 foundations of mindfulness, the 3 visions from the Sakyalamdre tradition, and so on. And the little sentence I created for the logic of this framework was that we develop the capacities by using the practices to explore the concepts through the elements. And here we have them all listed. So how does a standard look? Well, the way standards are typically formulated is that there's a verb and then a statement. And Benjamin Bloom created these taxonomies of learning. So these taxonomies that have progressively more complex verbs. So it's harder to create something than it is to remember something. And there's corresponding verbs in all of these hierarchies for both cognitive tasks, affective tasks, and psychomotor tasks. So I chose the verbs for all of the standards from these taxonomies, hierarchies of learning. And so here's how they're written, and we're going to dive into them. They're divided by the contemplative capacity. So there's 6 standards for stability, 6 for virtue, and 6 for discernment. So they're organized in a matrix here to show you that much like the science standards, they are divided and incorporate all the dimensions. So these are the virtue standards. There are 2 for each of the path practices. So there's 2 reflective ones, 2 affective ones, and 2 attentional ones. And we can notice the concept tag. That denotes which of those 4 core concepts are integrated into a standard. So I have an example for each. The first one would be examine the advantages of your present physical, mental, material, and social condition and identify their dependencies on other conditions and beings. So this is a preparatory practice, much like contemplating our precious human birth. It incorporates the concepts of interbeing and causation. We have one from stability, and this is more classical mindfulness training in schools, right? The point of these standards is to broaden our understanding of what Buddhist contemplative practices can do in education. It's not just breath awareness or body sensation awareness, which is incredibly important. There's a lot more richness in the tradition. But this one is more classical. Demonstrate reliable and repeated placement of awareness on sensory and bodily objects, leading to sustained focus. And finally, one for discernment, for the affective, where we're developing an attitude. We develop an equanimous attitude towards the arising of pleasant and unpleasant mental and physical phenomena. So what are the next steps? I'm grateful to be working at a small school, so next year I get to create a year-long contemplative studies course that will be based on these standards. But most importantly, the next step involves you all. If you're inspired by this work, I would love to establish a committee for peer review of these standards and the framework that undergirds them, so that they can be deployed, hopefully at scale, and we can start to take contemplative education as seriously as we take math and science. No longer adding in 5 minutes of meditation at the end of class, but making it as serious as, let's say, a math course or a science course. Thank you all so much.